Hello, Jean. Thank you so much for joining me on Culture Chat today.
I'm glad to be here, Mimi.
Yes.
Hello, everybody.
Yes. Well, I am so excited to have you on as a guest because I have had the pleasure of actually reading your newest work, May. And without even knowing it, I have seen your work for many years.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, because I love Fables and Wonder Woman, and I read Transmetropolitan. So yes, I looked upon your CV, and I'm like, wait a minute, I've seen lots of Jean's work. You worked on this, you worked on this, and I just didn't realize you. I wasn't paying attention. As an early reader of comics, I actually loved looking at the art, but I never really paid attention. I used to just know who the authors are, and now that I have evolved in my understanding, it's like I'm starting to like just really appreciate the artists and the artwork a lot more than I did when I first started reading, and I'm starting to put like names to faces and names to books and characters, and so it's been quite an exciting journey for me.
I've definitely been through something. I'm still going through something like that myself, where sometimes I don't pay enough attention to inkers. So I'll have this learned discussion with other comic book artists where they'll talk about like, oh, and this inker handled Jack Kirby this way, and this inker totally did different, like Lost in Nature Jack Kirby. And he's like, oh, I didn't even realize those were different inkers on those early books. And just like, yeah, you can keep on diving deeper, and you will keep finding more things to learn and people who love it and can inform you. And actually, my big passion in life is I like talking to people who are geeky, which I describe as awkwardly enthusiastic about a subject that not everybody's enthusiastic about. So I love those people.
I love it. Yes. Well, we are in the same genre right here. We're meant to talk to each other today for sure. I
Cool.
think I could fit your definition of geeky, but because it's funny. I always tell the story about my comic book intro, but my husband is actually he grew up reading comics like X-Men and
Yeah.
Spider-Man and whatnot, and he collected. And he's from New York, so he would go to his corner store and pick up his comics,
Mm.
or go to the comic book shops and wait for the comics to come out. And when we first met, I used to kind of make fun of him for like every time we would go watch a superhero movie, he would whisper some sort of fact or that this was inaccurate, and I'm like, oh my gosh. And then he actually recommended I started read some comics, and I'm like, okay, I'm not opposed. And also, I'm pretty open with my life. And so most of my listeners know the reason I started reading comics is because of my insomnia. So he's like, well, maybe you should start
Oh,
reading and maybe it'll help you relax. And yeah, pretty much I was hooked once I started reading. And I was pretty excited actually to read volume two because your guest writer, Mark Wade, was my intro to comics because Kingdom Come was the first comic that I ever actually read. So
oh, that's awesome.
yeah, so it's very exciting. I was like, oh, very cool. And, it was just cool that every time I'm starting to actually be able to recognize names and artists and writers, I get pretty excited. But you're right. I know no inkers and colorists. I'm starting to kind of get, I'm like, what are the differences and pencilers and all these different technical aspects of the process. And after going to San Diego Comic Con and meeting you for the first time, I realized there's a lot that goes into the comics, and some people such as yourself do almost all of it. Like, I interviewed the very lovely Stan Sakai, and of course he kind of really
Uh,
does all of his stuff, but I mean not all, but he doesn't do the coloring. But you're kind of similar with May. I was so impressed that you pretty much it was your brainchild. You created this whole world, and it's quite a world, by the way. But you also did the art, you did the story, you did the writing, and so I just think at first I thought you were just an artist, and not just, but that you only did the art because from your other work.
yeah.
But then I see that you're an incredible writer as well.
Oh, thank you. I'll say that for the longest time I didn't write my own stories until and I always had the saying that I want to work with the best writer I can get, and so far I have not been that writer. I used to say that. But what happened is that twice in my career, a writer disappeared when a script was due, and those are the events that inspired me to start writing stories. One was a short story for Marvel with Iron Fist, and Stuart Moore, my editor, just had to get me through 5 different drafts of that story to make the short story actually work, where he was actually like, okay, now that's a good story. I finally have it down, which taught me a lot about how much I had to learn at that time. That was about 2003. And the second one was a series I was going to work with at IDW where the writer disappeared. And after that happened a second time, I thought, you know what? I think I'm ready to actually write something now. And I'd been studying it, and that's how May came about. But I still like playing with other people inside of these worlds, inside these sandboxes. So that's why I brought in Mark Waid to write chapter 8 of May, and Molly Jane Kramer to write the next chapter 9, because they just had different things to say than I could, and it made the world bigger and better. Just having these people with these different viewpoints on my world just add something to it. It was just amazing. I love it.
Yeah, and we're gonna dive into that in just a second. But so basically, out of necessity, which is how I often find a lot of the tasks that I have to do, because someone doesn't show up, and out of necessity, I had to learn to like video edit, or out of necessity, I had to learn. So I completely can understand that. But I think something like writing, especially, it's something that you have to really work hard at and also be very good at. But do you think that maybe the fact that you have been doing the artwork for so many of these characters in these stories and having that connection, does that make it easier for you to kind of adapt and be able to write, or is it just two different animals?
Oh, I will say they are definitely two different animals, but it does help you understand it. It's writing comics and drawing comics is a lot like the difference between writing a screenplay or writing a stage play, and then being the troupe or the production company that makes it. And you may think that because you're the producer or the director, or even like the lone person who just took a script and produced everything, you could write your own script. But once you actually dig in, it is its own thing. You understand what's going on, but there are levels to it that were totally new to me. And that's what Stuart Moore taught me with the Iron Fist story. It was just, you don't have to, but ideally you look at every aspect and every character separately and make sure they make sense. And every reader's going to have a different viewpoint. And you want enough of those people to actually, from their viewpoint, for everything to make sense to them and to be entertaining and to be surprising, so it still works. And it's like the famous lesson with Roger Ebert went through when he wrote his first screenplay, where critics have no matter how broad-minded, they always have a very narrow view of what a good movie or a good play is or anything like that. And when you start writing yourself, you find out that there's a million other things you have to take into account to make a story work. And it's so much harder. And Roger Ebert got a much greater respect for writers after he wrote a very, very bad movie.
I think that's kind of the case with so many things, though, right? Like we can criticize and say, oh, and when we get up to actually do it, you're like, okay, well, things are much harder. So, but, speaking of May and this brainchild, this amazing world that you've created, so just so our listeners who aren't familiar with May, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the world that you've created, because I want our listeners to realize that you have quite an imagination. I mean, there's cats and monsters, or monster cats. I don't know if you can even say they're combined, but there's, queens and soldiers and different languages. And it's so unique. I felt like I was in a sci-fi adventure, like Goonies, Time Bandits type of story, and it was so much fun. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about the world that May and Annie discover, and just kind of the world that you created.
That was really perceptive in that Time Bandits is actually a huge influence on May, but I usually don't mention it. If I'm just going to jump to the world and not get into the story so much, but it's the back history of this other world that the heroes go through a portal to visit, is that around in the middle 1800s, a gateway opened up inside of Czechoslovakia, what we call the Czech Republic today. And a scientist figured out a way to go through this portal and visit this other world where there were no humans, but there were monsters, and where mad science experiments that wouldn't work on Earth normally worked there. And he's living inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so he really doesn't want the government to know about this and for them to take over this world just the way they took over the Czech lands. So he invites other Czech scientists in, and eventually they start inviting in Czech American scientists and eventually African American scientists, who are also people who would be a little bit afraid of their government also taking over this world. So it becomes this secret between all these scientists who are going to this world and setting up cities and doing experiments and having great fun. And then around 1910, the gate just closes, and they're cut off from our world for decades. And this world builds up where they have all these different factions and nobles and science councils all competing against each other until the older sister of the hero, Abby Fortell, sneaks into this world herself, and she just begins having adventures there. And then I don't want to go into details of what happened, but everything goes she becomes a hero, and then everything goes very badly wrong. And she gets sick of this world, comes back, tells her sister what happened. Monsters from that world follow her back to Indiana. And this is how the younger sister then gets dragged into that world again. But unlike her older sister, May Fortell has been on Earth all this time, going to school and being responsible and following a lot more geek media than her older sister. So she understands this world in a way that the sister who actually lived in this world for 8 years doesn't. And she's able to do neat things because she's a grown-up and her older sister is not.
Right. Oh, yes, yes. And it's, you're so specific there, very, very, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Czech Republic, this is very, very specific. And the language and everything is reflected in that. And I just found it really fascinating. Why did you kind of decide like that was where it all needed to be?
Oh, man. Okay. There's a lot of things that happen inside of fantasy novels where it's fine, but it's not entertaining to me.
Okay.
And one of the things is that, if like, I love Game of Thrones.
Okay.
But the names sometimes drive me a little bit crazy because I grew up in a suburb and a subdivision inside of Indiana with a golf course in my backyard and street names like Foxcross and Lincroft and Berry Knoll. And then when I go into the Game of Thrones world and hear in Westeros that they have places with names that sound like the streets I grew up on, and the golf course lanes, areas I grew up on, is kind of like, okay, this sounds like I'm stuck inside my suburb again. I really didn't like
it removes
growing
you
up.
from the fantasy.
Yeah, I keep on expecting golfers to like walk through, golfers in 80s fashions to walk through the middle of the sets and start golfing in the middle of battles. So I wanted something a little bit different that way.
I see. Well, it mission accomplished.
Yeah. Visually and also in sound, the Czech language looks awesome and it sounds awesome, and it's very alien to us. So when I got the help of a Slavic languages professor at the University of Chicago. I'm the worst person for remembering names right now. Sternberg. Malin Sternberg, Professor Malin Sternberg. It's mentioned in my book, and that's actually the source for the full name of May after I created the character. She helped me with names and also very creatively made up names, which were kind of nonsense combination words and stuff like that. Portmanteaus. It's just, she's just been brilliant in helping me out with that type of stuff.
Yeah, well, it was definitely a lot of fun, and like you said, it really removes you from Earth. It removes you from what we believe to be Earth, right? Like you really feel like you are transported into that world. So yeah. I found that really fascinating. I thought, oh, okay, or are you just kind of messing with us and making things like we're like, okay, we're going to try to pronounce this and just be completely silly.
Oh yeah. I will say also something I've learned is that for young readers, they just jump into the world and they're great with everything and just things rush at them and they don't need everything explained. For what I call grognard readers like myself, older middle-aged guys who have been into fantasy for ages, they want everything explained, and it's kind of like my philosophy on this is one of the things I love about Star Wars is the first Star Wars movie, Episode 4, is they did not explain everything. They did not show the Galactic Senate when they talked about the Galactic Senate. And then the movies really fell down when they decided, we're going to have a scene where the Galactic Senate has to make a decision. Well, we better spend about like 10 or 15 minutes just showing a bunch of senators debating really slowly. And it's kind of like, you don't need to show everything. And if you don't show everything, there's actually this great virtue of it, beyond just not slowing things down. Of also, if you describe something and don't show it, a really creative reader or viewer is going to look at that and they're going to imagine it, and it's going to be better than anything they could have. It's going to be better than anything you could have drawn or filmed, and it's going to inspire their imaginations, and they're going to want to make things.
Now that is really fascinating to me because I know I like episode 4, 5, and like I know I like
Yeah.
the earlier stuff, and I know I get irritated by a lot of the newer films, and I can name all my little like, oh, this
Yeah.
and this and this is why. But that is really fascinating because without realizing the reason, I completely agree with you. Like that is so well explained to me. Like thank you for explaining to me why I get frustrated at some of the newer films, and I a lot of the young people chalk it up to, well, you're just older, you like that generation. But you're right, and that in fact is the same thing where we try to encourage people to read, right? Because your imagination
Yeah.
does so much more, and that's why I rarely hear anyone who's told me that they like a movie better than the book, right? It's always, oh, well, the
Yeah.
book, it wasn't as good as the book, because that's part of it. One is the immense detail, but also like, yeah, what's in your imagination and you're creating, and, such as you've done with May, and even just like the names of the characters and the places, it does like just create all this stuff going on in your head. This, these thoughts and creativity. What is this? But yeah, that's really fascinating. I really love that you explained that about Star Wars. So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And hopefully I'm going to hope that like 3 years from now, you're going to come up with this great, amazing script for a comic book that's going to get, be on the shelf pretty soon.
Me?
Or all the viewers out there, I hope you're all inspired to be
Oh,
creative by
yes.
just
And,
thinking
and,
about these.
and I love that. I love that. I did actually have the pleasure of seeing your panel at SDCC, and I will not lie that, some of it was way beyond my comprehension because my Photoshop skills are very primary. And you were like really kind of just giving so much, obviously, valuable information, especially for artists and people who are trying to, recreate the type of art that you do and everything. I thought it was fascinating. But what you did say at the end of your talk was really inspiring, which was that you encourage people to be creative, go out and do things they enjoy, with a full heart, and just, kind of being true to yourself. And I feel like it seems like like an obvious thing to tell people, but I feel like it was really important. And the people that were with me, they were with me because I was like, come on, you're coming with me to this panel because I have to go here, here, and here. And, not that they weren't interested in what you had to say,
Yeah.
but, they had never read May, and they're not really readers, but they were like, wow, that was really awesome what he said about that at the end, so they were really connected by what you kind of mentioned at the end of your panel.
Yeah. I'm going to mention one trick for visual artists out there. And you don't have to be super sophisticated to get this point, which is that I do a very, very, I'm just going to hold this up to the camera really quick, very kind of richly colored, deeply atmospheric world visually. But that's actually, in a way, kind of less visually powerful than really stripping things down. A really clean, simple graphic, which is what most people want to do with their art, engages less part. There's like different visual. Okay, you have two eyes, and they both feed into the brain, but there's like multiple visual centers in your brain. I'm getting to a really important point here. And if you only engage one or two of them instead of like all 10 or 11 or whatever there are of them, it sends those visual centers a really powerful signal, and your brain interprets it super fast. And it takes a little more work if you use every part of the visual centers. And I'm using almost all of them except for motion. If you just send it to a few of them, the impact's really powerful, which is why something like Frank Miller's Sin City is so powerful, because it doesn't include outlines for the most part. It's mostly form and light and dark. And so pretty much only like one or two, like two centers of the visual centers of the brain. So the impact is really strong. So if you want to take your art and do something really stripped down, that actually works really well. Scott McCloud inside of Understanding Comics talks about some similar concepts and stuff like that. So just because you can't do something as visually sophisticated as mine doesn't mean you can't do something at least as visually powerful as my work. And yeah, just do it. Just do something simple and powerful, and it will work great.
Wow. Okay. So, do you teach?
No.
No.
Sometimes I lecture or give guest talks to classes, but no, I'm not a teacher.
Okay, because when we were at the panel, and I mean, I'm a kung fu teacher; it's quite different.
Yeah.
But I was like, I felt like you were a teacher, an educator, because you were so natural at kind of giving that basically teaching. You were basically teaching at your panel, and so I thought, oh, maybe I was wondering if you taught, because I was wondering if it's something you did, and even just kind of what you were explaining now, it's something that seems kind of natural for you.
Yeah. I guess I'm just naturally philosophical. I'm gonna ask you a question about some stuff. Okay,
Sure.
so there's a famous thing. Yeah, there's a famous thing in baseball where like when you have the major league baseball players, and they're trying to hit, and the pitcher's throwing a fastball, and the batter is trying to hit it. They literally can't move their head and their eyes fast enough to actually follow the ball,
Hmm.
and they have to imagine the ball coming at them. And that's almost completely just one part of their brain, the motion sensing part of the brain, which is separate from all the others, just imagining that ball coming towards them and where it's going to go so they can swing at it. And I'm imagining that there's a lot of things that happen when you're doing martial arts where it's happening so fast, you just have to kind of simplify how you understand what's going on around you and just, not get distracted by, say them like trying to do a fan the other hand when you know that their center of balance is moving or something like that. Just there's a lot of distractions, and you must have a lot of control over your visual centers when you're doing stuff.
I hope I do. Yes. So
Yeah,
so the baseball analogy is great because there's that basically you're anticipating, right? So yeah, there's that
yeah,
you're imagining what's happening, but there's that anticipation of motion and movement and whatnot. For martial arts and for kung fu, for me, like if you're working with weaponry or we're doing like a fight set with someone that's choreographed, because I also
yeah,
used to do stunt work. Definitively, I mean, I don't know about the technical way you're explaining it, but yeah, I think that it probably is very much that where you're basically you have to simplify it because if you're overthinking it, then you'll probably get hit in the face.
okay. So I'm going to ask you a weird question now. When you watch a magic show, is it a different experience than most people get from a magic show? Because I mean, you're somebody who works with their hands and watches other people work with their hands and distractions. And do you kind of notice things the magician is doing that your friends aren't noticing?
I wouldn't say I'm that perceptive. I would
Okay.
like to pretend and go, oh yeah, of course I do. I do analyze it though. Like I
Yeah.
do sometimes have trouble just kind of sitting and enjoying. Like I am trying to kind of analyze and like, okay, where
Yeah.
do I think that's going, or where is his hands? Like sleight of hand stuff, But I mean,
Yeah.
whenever I do see like masters of their craft, I'm usually kind of in awe. But in terms of kind of going back to that movement part of it, for martial artists in particular, a lot of it is like repetition and practice, right? So
Yeah.
then it becomes like a little bit more muscle memory, and then it becomes a little bit
Yeah.
more where things just happen more naturally. Like we like to say, you have
Yeah.
to do so many repetitions in order to be able to execute something effectively,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. And another thing that where I get totally lost and my friends who do martial arts do really great is watching martial arts. I'm going to say specifically sword fighting, where for me, I just see some flashy lights of just light glinting off the swords, and they're like, "Oh, that was a great move! Oh, did you see that? Oh, you totally missed that!" And like, it's just like I didn't even realize which person hit the other person in that test match. And they were like, "Oh, that was great. That was smooth."
I would say it's exactly the same as if you were to look at art and you're able to kind of pick out the discrepancies and things like that, or where
Yeah.
things were off, or where someone's hand might have been shaky. And I'm just kind of like, oh, no, it looks great because I have trouble with stick figures. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, for sure, I'm a lot more critical when watching martial arts films or movement. But that is, again, just because that's what our expertise is. So, yeah,
Yeah.
it is interesting, though, thinking about what visuals do for us, right? So, like this is a podcast. So obviously we'll be on the YouTube, but also people are just kind of listening. So right now they're going, I wonder what Gene looks like, or, and they're like trying to put
Yeah.
your face to your voice. And when I read comics, I realize, okay, am I reading in my voice, in my head, or am I like putting voices to the characters and how you bring them to life? But when you kind of put like certain writers will usually, and I think this is where what we were talking about earlier, all the different aspects, like lettering is so important, because I've realized now
Oh
when
yeah.
I read comics, there are some comics I'll just close the book. I'm like, I'm done, because the lettering would just drive me crazy, or I would have to, because I read
Yeah.
mostly on my iPad. I will admit, I do like Comixology, or I'll use the library resource, or so if I
Yeah.
have to zoom in too much or what, I'm just like, I'm
Oh
done.
yeah.
I will move on, or if it's too cursive-y. And so lettering is such a huge part of it. So, and that also I think plays into how we hear the characters and everything. And I'm wondering, as the writer and also the creator, is that something where you do have kind of a say? Like you say, okay, I'm imagining it to kind of look all caps, or like, do you kind of
Oh.
give each aspect of the creative process, or is it just you just kind of let each person in their in their department do what they do?
Um, for the most part, I coordinate very tightly, and sometimes I have to do tweaks after every other person. Well, I work for the colors. He's the only other artist working in the book regularly.
Okay.
Wesley Hartman, also called Westflow, out of Texas. He's really great. But to make it look like it fits in with my work, I have to do a tweak after he gets done with it and he sends me his working file so I can Gene Holify it. I very rarely ever mess with the work of Xander Cannon, the letterer, who's also a writer. Yeah, it's just, and his lettering looks very, very different than my artwork, where my artwork tends to be very precise, and he's got kind of a loose, brushworky type of way of lettering. And he does it on a computer, but he actually hand letters it with a stylus and just writes everything out.
Really?
And I like that, yeah, and I like
Wow.
that looseness because I want it to feel like the characters are talking to you and they're not talking in a monotone, which too precise of comics lettering can look like. And just it humanizes the characters, and it also fights. My artwork can give the illusion, can look very precise. Sometimes it is very precise, and always gives the illusion of being precise. And I like having something in there that's loose and very personal to kind of humanize the characters. And I try to make the it. I mean, I've been accused the right word, accused of using CGI for my artwork, and I never do except for cars sometimes. I've done that a few times where I've used a CGI model just so I can get all the details right very quickly. But other than that, everything is hand-drawn. There's no 3D modeling. There's no 3D models of the characters. But my understanding of visuals is so precise and frankly so computer-like in some ways that people think I must have used computer to do it.
Wow. I guess it's kind of a compliment, right?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, let me just think, oh, they
Except
didn't
they're
work on this.
accusing me of doing something that, yeah, of not working as hard as I did, right?
Yeah.
But I mean that just kind of shows that it's almost like, oh, this is too good to be true. This is, they're actually not believing what they're seeing. And so maybe you have to be not as precise.
Yeah. I've got plans on that. Or
No.
yeah, loosening up parts of it so I can kind of
No.
show your work. Show your work. Yeah.
You've done the work, so I wouldn't worry about it.
Yeah.
That's like what I don't believe that, what's it called? Like when they made us in school show every single step of the math problem, which
Oh
I
yeah.
was never very good at. I'm like, why do we have to show every step? Like, just believe that I know what I'm doing. But so speaking of which, I mean, have you always been into art? Were you drawing since you were young? Were you always sketching? Did you know you wanted to be an artist?
My older brother liked to draw,
Hmm.
and I always wanted to be like my older brother, so therefore I wanted to draw. And my younger brother drew also, but they were both also really good at football and wrestling in high school and asking girls out, and I wasn't. So therefore I kept on drawing, and they stopped after a while.
Ah,
So.
I see. And once this started to become something, a little bit more serious, when was that? Did you go into college knowing, okay, this is what I'm going to study,
Oh.
or was it?
Yeah. Well, in high school, I started taking art classes, but my high school had not yet become an arts magnet school. It did later. So we didn't actually have a lot of good art classes to do. And when I showed my best projects from the class I had taken to get into an art school, uh, they just they didn't quite laugh, but they were like, this is not what a portfolio to get into an art school is supposed to look like.
Ah.
And I don't know why the College for Creative Studies let me in, but they did. I guess they saw some potential talent there, and it kind of worked out for all of us. So,
Yeah. And, as a fellow Asian American, I have to ask, what were your family's reaction to you wanting to be an artist and not like a doctor or lawyer? Because it's a little bit of a stereotype, of course, but I mean,
oh yeah,
most people I've had on the show that are, I had a DJ on
yeah.
and he's like, oh yeah, my parents were really happy about it. No, so I'm just curious, was that a difficult journey for you?
Okay, so one thing I'll never understand is my dad kept on telling me going to art school is a bad idea, but for some reason he still paid my tuition and my room and board to go to art school, and I'll never know why because he never stopped saying this is a bad idea, but he supported me to
Well,
do it. So yeah,
school is still school.
yeah, he did want me to go to school. He was happy about that. But yeah, yeah, and he appreciated later when I said, Dad, I do have to admit I have a lot of classmates who graduated who are not doing art anymore, and they're not using their degrees. This was a dangerous, risky, slightly foolish choice I did make, even though it worked out. So, and he's like, I appreciate you saying. He didn't say it that way. He was Korean grumpy about it, but he was like, you could see it was kind of like he gave the face that said, I appreciate you actually saying that out loud.
Well, that was actually quite nice of you. How evolved of you. No, but I mean, I just know that there are these, pressures that are on us,
Oh, yeah.
as Asian Americans. It's like, wait, what? Not doctor or lawyer, maybe engineer, And so
Yeah.
it's especially artists. I mean, they're like, how are you going to live? But it did work out. Like, what was your first kind of break? I mean, obviously you have such a slew of between DC and Marvel and all these other independent projects. You worked so much. And I mean, what was like the first foot in the door? Was it because you feel like you went to art school, like it made it easier, or?
Art school definitely helped, but when I initially, well, first I should start off that I broke in right around the time when Jim Lee and Todd McFarlane were forming Image and breaking away from Marvel, and they had become these giants in the industry, and it became and remains assumed that Asian American guys are natural comic book artists. They're just if an Asian American guy says that, no one questions it. There's no kind of like, oh man, you don't deserve to get in or anything like that. It's just, oh yeah, Asian American guys, because Jim Lee, literally because Jim Lee.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, he made it easy. If you ask an Asian American woman artist about this type of stuff, Jim Lee did his best, but he did not help. He did not help them as much as a precedent.
I see.
For me, it was easy. Yeah. But I sent in samples during my senior year in art school. I sent samples to Marvel, and then as a backup plan, I sent some to DC. And Marvel sent me back a form letter, which had a list of everything that could be wrong with your artwork. And they checked off all of them but storytelling, which they should have checked off. And then at the bottom, there's a little extra space. So they wrote down some more things they hadn't thought of before that you can get wrong with your samples.
Wow.
Yeah, and I was just devastated because I thought I was like, a hotshot illustrator inside my art school illustration program. But then I got a letter from Neil Posner at DC Comics, who's since passed away before I could meet him. And he said, essentially, you are not good enough yet to work for DC, but please send me more samples in case, maybe we can work, maybe we'll be. Mm-hmm. And that's what eventually got me into the industry.
Ah, okay. So perseverance.
Perseverance, and also an editor who actually enjoyed looking at samples, which I've never met another editor who actually enjoys the whole process, because the whole, 95% of the time at least, it's saying no, 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 no. And then people getting, bitchy about it. But he actually enjoyed finding new talent, and he's pretty famous for the people he brought in.
That's awesome. And I actually was at the Kauai Comic Con, and I interviewed. I know Kauai is awesome. I was like, oh yeah, no, I don't want to go to Kauai. It's gonna be so hard. Yeah. So, and I interviewed Carl Potts, who actually was one of the ones that brought in Jim Lee, and so we kind of talked about that process. And it's interesting because he said the same thing, where he actually would take the time to make sure he gave all the notes and everything. But it felt a little bit from your story like on the Marvel side, it was just kind of more negative, and you didn't feel like there could be like a shot or room for growth. But you eventually did get into Marvel. I mean, you've done so much work for them.
Oh, I mean, it was so much work for Neil to send me sample scripts to draw and then give me comments on those sample scripts.
Yeah.
He had to commit some of his free time to mentoring artists like me until we were good enough to get in.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, anyone who's got free time and has people saying, please help me break in, knows what a endless time suck it can be if you kind of commit to too many people.
Yeah.
So, Neil Posner is a saint for doing what he did for me.
Yeah. And obviously though, he saw your potential and, and
oh yeah, he had an eye for talent.
Yeah. It definitely all worked out. And so you're on this Marvel and DC journey, and you're working, which is great, because as an artist, you want to be working. That's the main thing. And I'm gonna say famously, if it's not famous yet, it should and shall and will be. But your quote is, "An artist can only draw so much long underwear and stay sane," and I love that. I
Yeah.
mean, and some people I think maybe just always enjoy like doing the Batman or doing the Spider-Man or whatnot, but it seemed
Yeah.
like you really wanted to draw other things. And so, at what point did you really feel that, okay, I'm not staying sane, and where did you see yourself going from there?
Oh man. I mean, it's if you're not going to get probably through an art school that has a realistic illustration or realistic art program unless you enjoy drawing the human figure. But still, it's just like it's you want to draw something that's emotionally registered with you. And a lot of the superhero stories didn't. And it's not even so much the costumes. This is just this. It's the whole set of stories where the idea that everything can be solved with a punch, and the kind of or the kind of the endless cycle that we've gotten to now, where it used to be that superhero stories were grounded into real life, so they kind of had an applicability because superheroes had secret identities, and a lot of that's gone now. Um, so I wanted something where it felt like it applied to life, and I guess the way I mean this isn't when I made that quote. That's not how I would have phrased it, but this is how I'd phrase it now. It's a quote from Samuel Johnson that I'm going to paraphrase heavily, and it's that the job of art is to make the everyday magical and the magical every day. And the job of art is to change how you see the world. And if it's a superhero comic book about superhero comics, which more and more a lot of superhero comics are, it doesn't change how you see the world except for when you're reading a comic book. And the power of art is to put new ideas in your head that you can use to understand the broader world around you. I mean, the best of the Marvel movies do that. The best of superhero comic books do that. I mean, that's why people love things like The Killing Joke or Watchmen. It changes how you see the world to a small extent. But if it's only about superheroes being superheroes and then commentary about like what it's like to be a superhero inside of a superhero world, if it gets too separated, it doesn't. It's just about that. It's about nothing else. And I wanted something that kind of was about life, not about art commenting on art commenting on art.
Fair enough. And I meant to ask you this earlier, going back to we were talking about being Asian American and as an artist.
Yeah.
Is there, I mean, obviously you're saying Jim Lee really paved the way. And do you think it's because of that there are kind of so many Asian American artists? Because, I mean, here I am at the SDCC booth, and right next to you is Jay Lee. And I'm like, oh, this is like the Asian American corner over here. And both
Oh,
amazing artists, So is there something to that? Like, is it just because maybe there's just a gravitation towards it, but really, I feel like the ones that I know of they all excel in the industry.
yeah. So there's quite a few Asian American women in comics, though they tend not to be quite as concentrated in the superhero books. And the superhero books, I think they're based on the Jewish American experience of the 1930s and 1940s. And if you look directly at a character like Superman, he's essentially a modern day Moses character who gets thrown into another culture. In Moses' case, it was ancient Egypt. In Superman's case, he goes from Krypton, which is kind of like an idealized Jewish planet, which died tragically, and then he comes to the middle of America, and he's very much like these two Jewish kids, Siegel and Schuster, who created Superman, ending up inside of Toronto and Cleveland, and then just trying to kind of creating a fantasy life about what it's like being different and special in a world and not understood, and they're just trying to figure out, find the hero inside yourself. And a lot of these metaphors really resonated with young Asian American men or boys, and a lot of girls too. But the comic book industry welcomed in the boys and not so much the women. So a lot of the women who were similarly inspired by superheroes, Asian American girls, went into non-superhero jobs, or a few got through the various jerky parts of comics culture,
Yeah.
superhero comics culture, and like Jillian Tamaki and a bunch of talented people like that, just making amazing work, using the talents they learned from superhero comics to make award-winning stories about life. And I'm also going to mention the other famous Gene among Asian American comic book artists, Gene Luen Yang.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then he obviously loves superheroes. And if you look at any of his work, you can see the thumbprint on his work of the signature of superheroes in his work. But he's, again, taken these tools he's learned and use them to talk about the immigrant experience in a totally different way than talking about Super Moses landing inside a rocket ship in Kansas.
Super Moses. I like that. That's really fascinating. And it's funny. It's that you were wrapping up your panel at SDCC, and my husband turns to me. He's like, ask him why there's so many amazing Asian American artists. I'm like, I'm not going to ask him that, because you're talking about art and their process. And he wanted me to ask you, and I'm like, I'll save it for the podcast.
Yeah.
You were wrapping up anyway.
Yeah. Oh, okay. One more thing is, okay, it's a combination. I'm just going to summarize. It's a combination both of loving the metaphor of the superhero and that giving us a tool to understand our lives as immigrants or the kids of immigrants inside of America. But I mean, lots of people from lots of different experiences take the superhero metaphor and find a way to apply to their lives, and it's not necessarily the same thing. But the other thing is we were welcomed in, and a lot of that is pioneers like Jim Lee and stuff like that, just making it seem normal for Asian American men to work inside of comics and draw comics. Less so in writing, but more in art. And if Jim Lee had been a great writer, the same level of famous writer instead of an artist, trailblazing inside of comics, I mean, things could have been totally different that way. I don't know.
Yeah. My hope, of course, is that, it is changing now. Like you said, there are more women being recognized and whatnot. Like I know, Monstress did really well, last year. And of course that work is great, both writer and artist being, women. And so hopefully that's going to swing because, your comic, coming back to that, your story, May, is pretty much like a girl power story, which I love. and I know you said you enjoy like young adult, stories and whatnot.
Yeah.
But do you have any sisters? Like, I love that you decided to write about two sisters.
Oh no. Yeah, it's when I talk about like I talked earlier about how like art can leaving gaps in art can create inspiration. In a sense, what I'm talking about is various forms of fan fiction, where we create headcanons and fan fiction and all these different types of things inside our heads. And May really got its start, the seed that planted, that kind of grew into May, was me making fan fiction about Kyle Baker's Why I Hate Saturn, a story about two sisters. But it's kind of like a realistic drama comedy graphic novel. But one of the sisters is probably delusional and claims she's been on another planet. She's the queen of the leather astro girls of Saturn. And you can see very quickly, very easily how that translates to the older sister, Abby, claiming she's the queen of the barbarian cat warriors.
Right. Yes, everyone, he just said barbarian cat warriors.
Yeah. Oh,
which is so awesome.
Yeah, barbarian cat warrior. So,
yes.
Yeah, but I began playing with that, and originally Abby was called Annie, only Annie, and I kept on drawing on her spacesuit, just playing around with this idea of the adventures of this girl who in a spacesuit who like goes to other planets and stuff like that, but her sister is left behind on Earth, and eventually I began shifting where I drew a long coat, an 1800s long coat on Abby, and I realized, this is a totally different story than I thought originally. And then I realized that also the more interesting character for me to work on and develop to create the character arc for was the younger sister, May, who I thought was a backup character at first. And as I began looking at the character from her viewpoint, it became more and more fun. And that's how it developed.
Yeah.
So fan fiction.
I love it. And I love also when creators put in there like, oh, here's my little sketchbook of like, here was my thought process. Because you can see how like the different characters evolved. And like you said, even the different costumes or different, clothing that they're wearing. And don't take this the wrong way, but I'm looking at your portfolio and I'm like, oh, you could totally do fashion sketches. You've got like such a flair for like these coats and these like really cool steampunky outfits. And it's really really cool to see. But I always like that when the artist kind of shares a little peek of their work, because it kind of makes you go, oh, wow, okay, this is how that developed. And you even gave us like a little bit of a vocabulary lesson so that we could kind of like relate back in case we were curious of what this meant or who these people are. Yeah. So that's always a lot of fun.
I'm just going to do a really quick description right now.
Yeah.
So you can't see this if you're only listening to the podcast, but I'm holding up a picture of the older sister, Abby, right now. And this neck piece here, the brass neck piece around her collar, That was originally the connecting ring collar for a space helmet in my
Oh.
original design. And these large kind of buttons here on the side, those were the little connecting rings for hoses, like on a spacesuit on the original design. And just when I threw that long coat over, suddenly it became just buttons on a vest. And I was like, and I think it's called, what? There's a name for the collar piece that on armor. I can't remember, cuirass. Anyway, but yeah, it just all became these traditional things were like inspired by things like George Washington's uniform and French Revolutionary War uniforms and
Yeah,
stuff like
she
that.
looks
And
like she could be straight out of like a steampunk Les Miserables, for sure.
oh man,
Which
see,
I
and
love.
you're
I
gonna be
love
the
it.
one to write it.
Yeah, I love that thought actually, because I love Les Miserables, and that's it's so much fun though. Yeah, it's so much fun. So if you are listening and you want to know about barbarian cats, like definitely get May. It's so much fun, but it's such a good read, and it really taps into your creative thought process, and it's just a lot of fun. It's a great story, and it's a sister story, which I have a younger sister, so I really connected with it, and I thought that was really cool as well.
Oh yeah, I guess the other obvious thing to mention is I got lost in my story a bit. Kyle Baker obviously is a guy, but he wrote a story about two sisters, and it surprised me when I read that, thinking, wait a minute, uh, he's an African American guy writing about two white sisters, and I can write about people who are not exactly like me, or and also aren't exactly like the protagonists in most of the comic books I've read, and that opened up my world to kind of say, if you learn enough about other people and explore your world, you're going to find lots of things that you can write about or you can be creative about that aren't what you've experienced before in your own life necessarily or in the books you've read. You can keep on expanding it out. And today I actually contacted the American, I can't remember the exact name of the organization, the American Indian Council of Chicago, and found a tribal elder of the Ojibwe to help me with an Ojibwe character I'm putting into a comic book.
Wow.
Not for May, but for another one. And she's just been incredibly gracious and just said, no, we don't. The Ojibwe don't have facial tattoos. If you want something that's really distinctive, you can put one feather in her hair, and she can have two long braids. And I would have been terrified of putting a feather in the hair of a comic book character because she's American Indian or Native American. But it's kind of like, okay, I know that's cool now. I can do that, and it has specific cultural significance. And just find people who love the thing you're interested in, and ask them, and you're going to find geeks everywhere who want to talk about it and want to help you out.
Yeah, and I love that you want it to be so authentic as well.
Yeah, yeah, and I really didn't want to screw that up and have someone come up to me later and say, yeah, the Ojibwe don't actually have facial tattoos. You're thinking of this tribe, and
Yes,
it's
yes.
nice of you to try, but try harder next time.
Yeah, I mean, after talking to Stan Sakai about the extensive research he does on every little detail of just the architecture, I mean, like I said, I've learned more and more that the amount that go into the creation of comics and graphic novels, and just like from the conception of the idea to the actual finished product is so much far beyond what I imagined it would be, and it's like
Yeah.
it's so cool. It's different than writing, I think, a novel, because you are also throwing in visuals. You have your sequential art, and then it adds a whole nother dimension to it, but also complication and more work, obviously. I mean, a different type of work.
You want to be able to look at yourself in the morning and know you told the story as well as you could, and you made a world that's internally consistent. This is the thing that Tolkien was really big on. Is that not that you want to avoid disbelief, you want to build belief so that everything makes sense when you put it together inside that world. I have another friend, Dan Brereton, who did a book on the ancient Roman Empire for an Italian publisher, and he did more research on stuff than the publisher or the writer had done on the visual stuff, especially. So they were asking questions like, why is that character wearing the toga over his head? You don't wear togas over your head. And he had explained to them, well, if it's really hot and sunny, that's actually the standard way that a senator would stay cool. He'd pull the toga over his head and use that to shade himself. And he wanted everything to make sense. And if it's hard to think of any ancient culture in the world, any pre-modern culture in the world that didn't have a good way to protect your head when it's sunny, because nobody had invented sunscreen yet, unless you want to take a dust bath.
Yes, this is true. This is true. No, yeah, the level of research I think is absolutely amazing. And but it makes sense, and especially if it's your project. So, you're
Yeah.
responsible for it. It's like it's all you. And so in volume 2, which is going to be out soon, in
Yes.
September.
Uh, it's coming out in comic shops on September 18th, and May Volume 2 is out in bookstores on October 1st.
Okay. So yes. So if you are curious, Gene's site definitely has all that listed, and he's going to be appearing at many more places this year. I see you have a lot of travel on your schedule, but I also noticed that Volume 2 you did a little bit differently, where you had some guest writers come in,
Oh,
like
yeah.
Mark Wade, of course, and I was
Yes.
very excited about that. And I was wondering though, as the creator of a project, what is that process like? Is it a little scary? Because like May is kind of like your child, like this
Oh,
whole world, and this, and now you're like, okay, letting someone else
yeah.
tell a part of that story must be very difficult.
It's, I'm going to say, actually, it's not difficult. It's actually kind of joyous for me. It's
Ah,
really fun. Yeah. The thing is, I came up through, okay, so my professional career, I mostly worked with writers. And if I work with a writer I like and trust, it's almost always been a great experience, except for the two times when
they didn't show
writers
up.
crapped out on, yeah, they didn't show up.
Well, then you didn't actually
Um,
work with them because they didn't work.
yeah. Let me see. The other thing is that in high school, I was part of the improv theater troupe inside of Clay High School, South Bend,
Oh,
and
cool.
also I played, yeah, and I also played a lot of tabletop role playing games like Dungeons and Dragons.
Okay.
And yeah, these are all collaborative, creative processes.
Hmm.
And when you do something like that, you're always going to come up with ideas that are way more creative than any one of the individual players could have done by themselves. And unless somebody's being a jerk, and it's you have a lot of fun that you wouldn't have otherwise. Just kind of the social aspect of it, and just bouncing the ideas back and forth. Just new things come up. It's greater. The sum is greater than the parts.
Yeah, yeah. And you really have worked with quite a list of amazing writers as well. So I think it's probably very insightful to kind of learn from people who have been in the industry for so long and been writing so long. And I mean, obviously Alan Moore, that's a huge name that you've been writing with, also won a lot of Eisners with. And so what was that experience like for you when you really started to work closely with writers of that caliber?
Oh man. I mean, kind of right off the bat, I began working with writers who just. I mean, I'm trying to think of like how many times I've worked with a writer who's less experienced than me, but definitely my first decade, they've all been brilliant, experienced writers. Alan Moore, um, Archie Goodwin, who he's one of the greatest American editors of all time. I think he is the single greatest American comics editor of all time. James Robinson, Kurt Busiek, Mark Waid, just oh man, I'm gonna insult somebody because I'm gonna leave them out because I've worked with so many great writers and stuff
I
like
know,
that. But
no, don't
that
worry. They understand. You're on the
yeah,
spot.
it's
But you do have
but
them all listed like in your CV, so.
oh yeah, but yeah, the thing is, I mean, each of them has a different viewpoint, and you learn different things from each of them. Um, Also, Xander Cannon, when I worked with him on Top 10, he was able to explain, because Xander Cannon is self-published comic, and I'd always been an artist working for big companies. He was able to explain different parts of the process of what Alan Moore was doing as a writer to me in a way that writers usually don't bother explaining it, and how he set up the script and the descriptions of the panels, and how he must be drawing a rough of what the page looks like before he writes the script.
Ah.
He like broke it down for me, like unless you're doing a rough of the page, you can't write a script that looks like this. And then he's not showing you the rough because he doesn't want to lock you down into using exactly the same composition he did. But it was just, yeah, brilliant. I worked with Archie Goodwin was the most important writer I worked with. He was also the editor in the project. He wanted to know who I wanted to work with. I said, this is before I did Top 10. I'd like to work with Alan Moore. He said, well, Alan's kind of not happy with DC right now, so you can't pick him. But would you like anyone else? I said, Archie, I'd like to work with you. And he had trouble believing me at first, but I really did because he was such a brilliant man and such a great writer. So he wrote me a story, and I began going wild with the first page's composition when I showed him the roughs. And he said, no, 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 no. This story is building up in tension. And if you do all the dramatic stuff on the first page, then the big turning point crisis, the climax is not going to be exciting.
And nowhere
And
to go.
yeah, he showed me pacing and all these different tricks that I didn't understand until I'd worked that closely with the writer. He's just, I've had so many great mentors throughout my career, and it breaks my heart when I hear about young artists today who just can't get older creators to be helpful to them. So I try to return to the younger creators all the kindness I was given by older creators.
That's really nice. You're paying it forward. So has that been something you've been doing where, there are younger writers who are, looking for someone to help with their projects? Do they reach out to you? How does that work? Do they just go, "Hey, Gene, do you mind checking out my project?" No, but I'm just saying in general, like even through the industry, I mean, you've obviously, even with me, generous with your time, taking time to talk to me today. But has that been something you've been doing as well as mentoring?
Yeah. I mean, it's something you have to be careful about because you don't want to throw advice at people who haven't asked for advice because they may have a vision you don't understand. And if you start saying that, "Oh, why isn't your perspective more realistic?" or something like that, and they're not going for realistic perspective, then you're just being a jerk to them.
I think I have a hard time imagining that anyone would think you're a jerk. You're one of the nicest guys I've met, especially at Comic-Con. Everybody was so nice, but you were so gracious. That's why we kept hanging around your table. You guys were so nice to us.
Oh, I'll say that the rise of the word mansplain has helped me to mansplain less. So, I mean, yeah, thank you for people who invented and spread that term. But yeah, I mean, just when young creators come up to me and I do have that, and when I'm in a situation where I have the time to do it, I like to go through portfolio reviews with people, and I try to measure how much help they actually want, and I try to give them one. I'll give an off-the-cuff critique on different things I see that's could be done better in their work, but I don't criticize everything, and I try to focus it on, by the end of it, on one step they can take that they can work on in the course of, say, a month and massively improve their work. Just I give them one solid piece of advice, which is like, work on this, and your work's going to be better, and it's going to be closer to the vision inside your own head, I think. And I'll question them along the way of like, is this what you're trying to go for? Is this what you're trying to go for? Because if you're giving them advice on stuff that's, again, if they're not going for realistic perspective and you spend the whole time talking about mathematical three-point perspective, you've wasted their time and you've wasted your own time. So.
See, you are a teacher.
Yeah.
That is definitely right, the right concept for teaching. Like it's even with something like martial arts, if you're gonna name 100 things for someone to work on, they're gonna forget all of them. Yeah. But if you like focus on the priority, that's awesome. So final couple questions, because I know you probably have to get back to work. But what did you like to read, or like comic wise or book wise, when you were younger, and what are you reading now?
I like to read. When I was younger, I liked to read. I loved superhero books so much when I was a kid, and it allowed me to kind of imagine bigger things than was possible in movies back then. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, so before the rise of CGI. So if you wanted to imagine somebody with metallic skin or realistic drags with muscles and bristling scales, these are all possible things to do now. But back then, they were just impossible. You could not do it in a movie. And you could just imagine these worlds and situations that were just impossible to otherwise do. Even something as simple as like flying over an alien world and like coming down for a landing. This is something that could only be done in a comic book back then. So, I mean, I would visualize these things in my head, and comic books created these worlds that were so big, it kind of got me ready for this post-CGI world and being a visual artist inside of it. Mm-hmm. I can't think of any other way I could have really kind of prepped for that. It was just big, beautiful visions, and sometimes crudely drawn by today's standards. But the imagination of someone like Jack Kirby is just so big. It's still a beauty to look at now. Nowadays, I was mentioning I like you can create something very emotionally and visually powerful, especially if you strip it down. And there's I'm just going to name one artist right now who has a creative vision that's gigantic. Faith Erin Hicks, The Nameless City. It's a 3-volume graphic novel series, or it's a trilogy, and it's obviously really largely inspired by Avatar. It's about Avatar the Airbender, not Avatar.
James Cameron.
Yeah, not James Cameron. But it's a non-magical world where it's the ruling nationality inside of a multi-ethnic empire and multi-ethnic capital city, and just dealing with the politics and the culture and clashes that go on inside there, mainly from the viewpoint of the teenage son of a general. So the brilliant thing about this series is beyond just being visually beautiful and huge and just brilliant and stripped down in a beautiful way, it also is able to cover this broad swath of the culture of the city from this viewpoint of this kid just running around the city and being a jerky and sometimes nice teenage kid. But he'll like walk into a room or be walking past a room where his dad is arguing with another powerful politician or general, and they'll be talking about stuff, and you realize this is a great conversation, but the kid's point of view is, oh, this is boring. I'm going to run away now. And it's just like, oh man, she does not slow down the narration to kind of like stop in this conversation, but just gives you enough of a clue that, oh, that's something big happening, and a lot of people are going to die if that person wins the argument. And it's just brilliant the way she handles this in this kind of walk and talk way that reminds me of things like the West Wing TV show. Mm-hmm. It's just very walk and talk, things happen, fast. And then they move on.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a great series.
Oh, cool.
It's visually powerful and just so relevant to today, and also just a great story about a coming-of-age story. It's just so much fun in every way.
Oh, awesome. Well, I look forward to that. And our listeners, please check out Gene Ha online. You can get all the information about his projects at geneha.com. Very, very nice and easy to search for. But in addition to all of the work that he's done over the years, this project is, of course, very special to him. And it is coming out in September and October. So please check it out and let us know what you think. We definitely want to know what you think. And thank you so much, Gene, for joining me on the podcast today. It was such a pleasure to talk to you, and I hope that I will be able to have you back.
It is huge fun talking to you, both here and also at Comic-Con. It was just, you are a very, very fun person.
Oh, thank you so much. All right, until next time. That's all for today's episode. Thanks for listening to Culture Chat, and hope you enjoyed the conversation. Please subscribe and rate my podcast. Feel free to leave me suggestions or send an email to mimi@culturechatpodcast.com or follow me on social media at Sifu Mimi Chan on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook.